Operation is historic. It was one of the most sophisticated and complex operations you can run. It will go down in military doctrine and military history.
Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. I want to start by talking about the operation in Venezuela to capture President Maduro. How impressed were you with this operation?
Impressed is probably an understatement. This operation is historic. It was one of the most sophisticated and complex operations you can run. It will go down in military doctrine and military history. I know in broadcasting to the UK, your SAS and SBS, your Special Air Service and Special Boat Service, which are like Delta Force units, are probably looking closely at this to garner what they can learn from it and possibly replicate in future raids of their own.
What kind of planning goes into this type of operation?
So, this was a probably long mission planning and preparation cycle. It could have been a month, it could have been 3 months, but they knew Maduro and they wanted this military option of going in and getting Maduro out. With these type of missions, the more time you have, the better. It allows you to be more diligent with your planning, and we go through a military decision-making process and a planning process, trying to leave no detail out of the equation, as well as heavy contingency planning. So the hard part here with Maduro, the illegitimate president of a country with his own security detail, with a conventional military, it's ultimately where do you try to conduct a capture and extraction. And so it's establishing a pattern of life with a interagency intelligence mechanism. So CIA on the ground, following his pattern of life, ISR or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, layering that all together to give the assault force, the capture force, the best picture of where and when they're going to try to take him out. And then there was word that they replicated once they figured out that where he bedded down, as we say, where he slept, they replicated that building. I can't, substantiate if that is actually factual, but it's not uncommon for American forces to recreate a building to allow the assault force to do rehearsal after rehearsal. And with each rehearsal, you learn something new and then you revise the plan again. So with something like this, probably very extensive, and those guys were probably removed from the rest of the forces, removed from their families to focus on this full time over a period of months.
Were you surprised at how well the operation went? Obviously, there was no American fatalities. It seemed to go completely smoothly.
Yeah, that's the shocking part. Again, you're going into a denied territory with a conventional military, the Venezuelan military. Even Maduro had Cuban security forces guarding him. So you're talking about air defense threats. You're talking about armored vehicles, and I think the Americans had over 150 aircraft in support of this mission. That right there, with 150 aircraft in an airspace, that is major synchronization of assets, deconfliction of airspace. That's not easy. And it speaks to the U.S. military and the operations and what they've learned over the last 20 years in the global war on terror. But you saw multiple pre-assault fires, as we call them, where the U.S. military struck multiple locations in and around Caracas, and really probably served a few purposes. One, to clear the air corridors for the assault force going in to capture Maduro. That means removing any air defense threats. The fact that they hit multiple locations adds to the deception of what's going on. The Venezuelan military took multiple hits in different locations. They didn't know if the U.S. Marines were coming across the water for a full-scale invasion, and that means they have to defend everywhere. And when an enemy defends everywhere, they defend nowhere. So it was beautiful deception. And then ultimately they took out the power grid, whether that was an electronic warfare attack or espionage. It shut out the electricity in Caracas, which aided the assault force. But for the assault force to get in unopposed, spend minutes on the ground, eliminating the security forces and surrounding Venezuelan military threats and capture Maduro within minutes, that is a level of operational prowess that rarely exists in the world, Again, such units as Delta Force, Special Air Service, Special Boat Service, those are the type of units that are the only units that are capable and have the capacity to perform something like this.
How important was the element of surprise in this operation?
Vitally important. People knew that President Trump and the administration had this option on the table. They could always go in and forcefully remove Maduro. The question is when. So you have the element of surprise there of the Venezuelans. Even the Americans didn't know it was coming. But usually, when we talk about combat, we say you want to achieve three things: speed, surprise, and violence of action. And the U.S. forces and Delta Force executed all three of those flawlessly.
Do you expect that a lot of Venezuelans were killed in this operation?
From initial reports, we've heard close to 100 to 150 Venezuelan forces were killed. Amongst that 150 were also 30 Cuban security forces soldiers. That's just the unfortunate side. And for some people, they don't think that's unfortunate, but that is sort of the cost of executing one of these missions. And it was successful at the end of the day. They achieved their objective, which was to capture and extract Maduro and his wife.
For some people, it might seem surprising that Maduro, for example, didn't make it into his safe room. How wasn't he able to react? He reacted seemingly so slowly, or maybe the US forces were prepared for every eventuality.
I guarantee American forces, again, in the months of planning and preparation and the rehearsals they conducted, were prepared, even if he did make it to his safe room. So, these units, again, have a breaching capability that is world class, whether it's an armored door, or if they're thick concrete walls. They have means to negotiate those obstacles in order to get to their intended target.
Now, you've mentioned some of the Venezuelan opposition or means to oppose a US operation, so the Cuban security forces, the regular army, but also the air defenses. And we know that Venezuela has some Chinese technology operating in anti-aircraft sort of missiles and so on. Were you surprised that this technology seemingly failed to make any impact on the American aircraft or planes?
No, in reports state that they had both Russian and Chinese military equipment. So the thing about China that we have to take into account is, while they have a large GDP and a heavy defense budget, they're creating technology that has been relatively untested. If I asked you what's the last time the Chinese military went to war, you'd probably have to think about that quite a bit. So you have a military force, though large in number and assets, that is relatively untested, as well as their equipment. There are reports that indicate the major increase in Chinese naval assets, ships, that the integrity of those ships is in question, the aluminum in the building of them. So, when you try to mass produce assets or military technology in order to get it onto the ground, and it is relatively untested, then you run into issues like this. And that's why, one, either the Americans took it out easily, or two, it was ineffective against American aerial targets.
Now, I know that you served in the Middle East and you did a lot of tours in Iraq, Afghanistan. This obviously was quite a different operation, operating off the Venezuelan coast. What's the kind of complexities around that, operating from aircraft carriers and so on, versus having a base actually on the ground?
Well, I deployed outside of Iraq and Afghanistan for multiple missions, and sometimes alongside your special boat service or special air service. So operating off what we call an afloat forward staging base, does have complexity, especially to the aircraft. They're exposed to, the sea salt, which, metal and sea salt don't work well together. But again, we've done this so often that we know how to take primary maintenance and care of those aircrafts. But the beauty of an afloat forward staging base launching off a aircraft carrier is you can determine the position, which is much different than a fixed location departing from the ground. So if we need that aircraft carrier to move to a closer location and close the distance on a target, and also for recovery or exfiltration and extraction, that is the benefit of launching from sea. And again, we've operated off of afloat forward staging bases, launching missions quite a bit for the last 20 years, that these lessons are now memorialized and written into military doctrine.
We saw videos of the explosions around Caracas, the missiles and so on that the American aircraft were firing down on the Venezuelan capital. And one of the places that was targeted was Hugo Chavez's mausoleum. Now, can you think of any strategic reason why the US military forces targeted that site?
No, that is symbolic. That is purely symbolic.
And is that usual to do that kind of symbolic attack?
I can't remember an incident where we've done that before. But I mean, you even look at when we took out the Iranian general in Baghdad. That was symbolic. One, we wanted to remove him from the battlefield. He was the Quds Force commander, but it was symbolic, striking him in Baghdad near the embassies. The hatred amongst the Venezuelan people for Hugo Chavez and naturally his replacement Maduro. It was symbolic to show that one, we will not tolerate despots, tyrannical leaders within the Western Hemisphere, and quite frankly around the world. So it was probably a symbolic move in solidarity with the Venezuelan people who, as we saw, celebrated in the streets. They were dancing, they were crying, they were laughing, and oppressed people for the first time that felt a semblance of freedom from tyranny.
So this was a Delta Force mission, not a SEAL mission. Now, most people probably have heard of the Navy SEALs. That's the most famous, most portrayed special operations unit in the US military. Can you explain the difference between the Delta, the SEALs? Is one more elite than the other? How does that work?
Well, the premise to your question is slightly off, because the Navy SEALs, the SEAL teams, are part of what we call our Tier 2 forces. That is we often refer to it as the regular special operations. The Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, known as the Green Berets, Navy SEALs, MARSOC, those are Tier 2. Tier 1 forces in the United States are much like your SAS and SBS. That is your Delta Force and, of course, SEAL Team 6. So those are the units that are capable of doing this. Now, why would one be selected over the other? Sometimes it just comes down to regional or geographic alignment, that they are tasked with any mission within a certain region of the world. And you'll find that common practice. So it's not that one is better than the other. They're both elite in their special ways. It's almost like ice cream. They're both ice cream, but just slightly different flavors. For this one, Delta Force was selected. They absolutely flawlessly executed this mission. And as an American, regardless of who received the mission, you're just wildly proud of them in America for the way they executed that mission and that all the guys came home.
Can you think of a comparable mission that has been so successful in recent years?
You have many. You've got the Bin Laden raid. You've got Baghdadi, the removal of Baghdadi. You've got hostage rescues that have taken place that were Tier 1 forces that successfully achieve those missions. Which makes this one unique is that the Venezuela, usually those are against terrorism forces, but in the case of the Bin Laden raid, you're going into a region with a conventional military, the Pakistani military, and they have an air force. So that's what makes these unique. And the UBL raid and this raid are similar in nature. The fact that they weren't going into denied territory owned by transglobal terrorist organizations, unconventional militaries. They were going into sovereign nations that have their own conventional military. And that's why the complexity and the sophistication and the overall threat of these missions are higher.
President Trump has talked about other Western Hemisphere presidents watching themselves or being careful, for example, the Colombian president, because so much drugs flow from Colombia into America and so on. Do you think that after this operation, it will be much harder for US forces to say, do a similar thing in Colombia or other places, Mexico and so on, because these presidents are, they've been warned or they may adapt their tactics and so on?
And that may hold true. They may adapt their tactics and overall their vigilance. Let's use the example that you're probably referring to, Colombia. Their vigilance will be much higher. But it doesn't preclude the military with the capability we have of conducting another one of these missions. Again, much like your SAS or SBS would be able to execute this type of mission. So, you would approach that mission set also with more vigilance and caution and diligent planning to take that into account.
Maduro himself, obviously he's been in power for a few years now. There's been some other operations to try and remove him. Why do you think he's lasted so long and been kind of invulnerable up until this point?
Well, it's not much different than Panama and Noriega. These despotic leaders feel that they're too big to fail, that they're untouchable. The overall operation against Venezuela was increasingly ramping up the pressure, which then puts them off balance. It hit their wallet through the oil sanctions and embargoes and the seizures of tankers. So they become more desperate as more pressure is applied. So we call this preparation of the battlefield. We're going to throw our enemy off balance. We're going to add chaos and ambiguity and volatility to the battlefield before we intend to strike. So it was beautifully orchestrated in that sense that we set the conditions and we chose when to strike.
When you saw these videos of him dancing and so on, and Trump, has talked about him sort of stealing his dances or whatever, but do you suspect that Maduro was complacent? He thought this would never happen, maybe because he thought America would never attempt to do such a thing, but also because, he's got his security forces and his Chinese air defenses and so on.
I can make a reasonable assumption that when you're the leader of a nation, you probably feel like you're the most powerful man on earth. But to taunt the United States, especially President Trump, be careful what you wish for. And he got exactly that. It does show that no despotic, tyrannical leader is outside the reach of the United States judicial or military, systems. And we proved that right there. And we've proven that over the last 20 years, often alongside our British counterparts in the military, is especially when we go conduct something like this alongside allies. And I know allies were not involved in this. We're even stronger. Each ally, whether it's Australia, it's the UK, Germans or the French alongside the Americans, your capability increases. Your ability to conduct operations like this increases. And quite frankly, as we're holding this last night, the UK and US were involved in a combined operation, the US in the lead, the UK in support, with the seizure of Bella 1, a Russian flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic off the coast of Iceland. That just goes to show when we're in cooperation with our allies, there's nothing that we can't do.
Let's talk about your career. What first drew you to the military, and can you just explain that first experience of being in the armed forces?
Yeah, I think just as a young man, seeing soldiers, getting to talk to them, listening to the stories of the World War II, Korean and Vietnam generations, you see it as a challenge because you put those men up on a pedestal and almost question yourself. And I think it's a very human question of, do I have what it takes to do what they did? And it became a challenge that became an obsession. And eventually I joined the Marine Corps, became a recon Marine and a sniper, and eventually a Navy SEAL. But I came in the late 90s during the Clinton administration when the military wasn't, I'd say, as upheld by American society as it is today. And so I got to see a pre-war military, but still the pride of wearing the uniform, of representing your nation, of going against bullies. And that's a common thread I often found amongst soldiers, again, whether they're SBS or in the SEALs, are men that just despise bullies. And there's an old quote, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to stand by and do nothing. And that's a mantra that almost every soldier, regardless of nation, understands, that somebody has to step forward and somebody has to do it. And unfortunately, sometimes that means violence. And that is moral clarity. You have to have moral clarity that, and in this case, sanctions, negotiations, even international pressure proved useless against Maduro, to the point where you have to make a decisive decision to utilize violence. And I do believe that is moral clarity. But the greatest pride of my life is having served alongside amazing men and women who were like-minded in the military.
You talk about moral clarity. Many people have criticized this operation against Maduro as a world superpower bullying a smaller nation, going against their sovereignty as an independent country and removing their president. How do you respond to that?
You know, it's all about perspective. The EU and UK's perspective on Russia right now is different because they're dealing with a bully, Putin, in their backyard, and they have a much different approach. If you lived in our shoes and understood that Maduro was an illegitimate president, he was one of the largest narco terrorists with the cartels. He was a cancer to the Western Hemisphere. And for too long, we've ignored the Western Hemisphere of the United States because we were so focused on the global war on terror alongside our allies. And that was the necessary fight. But Maduro was a doorstep, a forward operating base for China, Russia, Iran, and their influence. And by this decisive decision to remove him, we protect the sovereignty of the United States. We protect our citizens. But here's the thing that people are ignoring. Trump has reshifted or recalibrated the global chessboard. You know, China with their Belt Road initiative no longer has a access point into the Western Hemisphere. We have essentially decapitated BRICS from the Western Hemisphere, with the exception of Brazil, and that's being felt by China and Russia. They feel further isolated. So it was a necessary decision. But if people think that President Trump has brought instability to the Western Hemisphere, in my opinion, they're wrong. He removed the source of instability, Maduro, from the Western Hemisphere. And we cannot allow people that utilize murder and torture and incarceration of their people to maintain power in place. And, I want to touch on a false equivalency. What I've heard is that because of President Trump's actions, that China is justified in potentially trying to seize Taiwan. That is a false equivalency, and anyone who brings that up is 100% wrong. That's like comparing apples and oranges. Taiwan is a sovereign nation, a partner of the world. They have their freedom, and China is leaning on historics, but essentially they want to own the semiconductor space. We had an illegitimate president who had murdered his own people, had oppressed his own people, had allowed our foreign adversaries and even terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas to utilize Venezuela as staging ground. Those are two completely different circumstances. So no, we've not justified China's impending invasion of Taiwan.
Going back to your career, so you joined the Marines in the late 90s, and then you decide to apply to go into the Navy SEALs. What drew you to that special unit?
Yes, well, I joined the Marine Corps because I knew a Force Recon Marine. The Marine Corps always had a version of special operations known as the Recon Community. However, they were not part of the U.S. Or the United States Special Operations Command. So they didn't have the benefit of the funds that come associated with U.S. SOCOM. They missed out on missions. And so understanding that, I made a decision, because the Marines are Department of Navy, to do a lateral transfer and try out for the SEAL teams. And it was right for my career, and it worked out beautifully. I'm glad to have been a United States Marine. I'm glad to have been a Recon Marine and a sniper, but also wildly proud to have been a Navy SEAL and serve in that community. It merely was a factor of, the SEALs were a part of SOCOM. And with that, you have more assets, you have more capability, you have more capacity.
So from a training perspective, what was the difference between being in the Marines and being in the Navy SEALs?
You know what? I wouldn't say there was much of a difference. Yes, assets, more bullets, more training ground, more money, better equipment. But really, I didn't see the difference until I got to the Joint Special Operations Command, the Tier 1 forces, where I worked, again, closely with SBS and SAS. And the difference there is I have nothing but the most profound respect for the UK and the Special Air Service and Special Boat Service. But if you want to look at a comparison that goes back to what I'm saying is, you have men, you put an SAS soldier and an SBS soldier right next to a Tier 1 operator from the United States, cut from the same cloth. same mindset, same mentality, same individual competent skills. But the difference when it comes to the budget is our defense spending just so farly outweighs other countries. We have more assets, we have more capability, we have more capacity to execute operations like these, where often our allies need to come to us to borrow assets to conduct these type of operations, which happen quite frequently during the global war on terror. So, that budget, that defense spending really determines the capability and the capacity of militaries. And we just received word Trump wants to further increase our defense spending. We got close to 1 trillion in the 2026 budget. He wants to take it up to 1.5 trillion, which is a massive increase in defense spending. Usually we've hovered around 3.5% GDP in terms of defense spending. He wants to take that up to 5. Ultimately, I think that will end up somewhere between 3.5 and 5, but not 1.5 trillion.
When it comes to an ordinary soldier, say in the Marines, versus a tier 2 soldier versus a tier 1 soldier, can you describe the differences, what differentiates those kind of levels?
Yes. First, let me state that, one life is not more important than the other. Ultimately, while special operations, and there's a lot of fascination with special operations, they don't win wars. They may help shape them, but it's units like the Royal Marines and the U.S. Marine Corps Infantry and U.S. Army Infantry. Those ultimately win wars, and the best example is World War II. Those were won by infantry. I think it's the level of assessment and selection of tier 2 and tier 1 forces is that one, they look at their intelligence level, they look at their physical capability, they look at their emotional and mental capability, and the assessment and selection process we put them through to select those personnel is much more rigorous than, let's say, your conventional infantry. And so really the success for these tier 2 and tier 1 forces is in the amount of time and the amount of resources they put into assessing and selecting what we refer to as future operators.
And when it comes to that assessment, how difficult is that? I was listening to Andy McNabb's book. I don't know if you know him, but he was an SAS guy, and he was, in his memoir, he describes just how difficult it was to get into the SAS and how many people dropped out because it was just so hard and, couldn't make it through those assessments. Can you describe your own experiences? How did you get through that stuff?
Yes. For our civilian counterparts that are listening to this, an assessment and selection is essentially a hiring process in the private sector. It is a very long behavioral interview, and sometimes those behavioral interviews will last 6, 9, 12 months or more. So, we really emphasize attributes. We're looking for attributes during the assessment and selection, and we're evaluating whether somebody's high or low within an attribute like resiliency, like the ability to work as a team, their drive, their emotional intelligence. Those are the things that these assessment and selections are designed around, is looking for those attributes. And the means by which we do it is through pushing people past their physical and mental limits. And that's what Andy McNabb is referring to. It's physically hard. It's emotionally and mentally hard. And you see when you push somebody past their comfort zones, emotionally and physically, or mentally and physically, that's where true character emerges, and we can truly assess those attributes. And some people, a lot of young men watch the movies. It looks really sexy. They want to go become a Navy SEAL or a Green Beret or a SAS soldier until they end up in the training, and they finally get the realization of how hard it is and how far we're going to push people. And while that assessment and selection process weeds out a good number of people, it's not like you've arrived. If you become an SAS soldier, it's not like after the assessment and selection, life is easy. Actually, when you get to your units, the training continues, and the training ramps up. We continually ramp up or raise the bar on the physical, mental, and emotional pressure that we put these guys under. And that is also a part of stress inoculation. Is we're constantly putting them in these volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments where they become inoculated to stress. They can compartmentalize stress. They can make decisions with limited information, and that is really what cuts the tier 2 and tier 1 operators apart from other military units.
It was interesting listening to that book. He was saying that lots of people, or some people, make it through those physical assessments and exams, some of the most brutal, tough environments you can put a human in. And then at the end of the whole process, they still get rejected for reasons that are never explained to them, because the unit or the people assessing them felt that they weren't a good fit within the SAS for whatever reason, psychologically, mentally, maybe they weren't a team player or something. Was it the same thing with you when you were going through these assessments where, you know, they're not only assessing your physical fitness, but also your sort of psychological fit within the team?
Yeah, they're assessing your physical fitness. They're assessing your tactical prowess, your tactical ability. But yes, no, often within these processes, they have psychologists that are part of the team that are putting these candidates trying to get into special operations through a series of tests. And when you have somebody for 6, 9, or 12 months going through a behavioral interview, you are watching. There's a lot of observation, and you know, we want to put people through the process, and we want the people that on the back end to make it that also are professionals. They understand when to use force and when to demonstrate restraint. And we don't want sociopaths. We don't want people that are so individualistic in nature that they can't work with the team. So those are often the X factors, as we refer to them, that we're looking for, that may disqualify somebody who, at the end of the day, and you said it, just aren't a culture fit for the units, and may be detrimental to the success of the mission or the overall culture of the units.
When it comes to some of those physical assessments, can you give us some examples of how brutal they can be? I'll give you one. A friend of mine is in the Paras in the UK, and he has this experience in his training called milling, which is essentially you have one guy and another guy and you just punch each other. And if you don't sort of duck or flinch or move out of the way, you pass that test. The whole point is to show that, you know, you'll be steady under fire and so on. And that was a very brutal thing, you know, people getting a lot of injuries and stuff from that. What kind of assessments or what kind of physical assessments did you go through? What was the toughest stuff that you experienced?
That's an easy answer. And, Navy SEAL Hell Week is well known across the world as one of the toughest evolutions. And it starts on Sunday night and doesn't end until Friday afternoon. And so for those 5 days, you're essentially moving without sleep. You're cold, you're wet, you're sandy, you're under physical exertion, you're under a lot of mental exertion. You're carrying very heavy boats on your head. You're working as teams. Guys will, from the sand in their uniform, it becomes like sandpaper. They'll have sores, open sores on their body, which every time you hit the ocean, they sting. That's where usually a SEAL training class known as BUDS will move from 250 candidates trying out for the SEALs. And it's not unheard of that only 10 make it through that process, or 25. The attrition rate can be about 80 to 90%. I think, one of the things you have to prove to these young men coming into the military is that your body can take an overwhelming amount of punishment and keep on moving. But, the body, the mind will quit long before the body does. And ultimately, that's where that mental component is in. And with the milling, is to show them that you can take damage, but ultimately your mindset will get you through any obstacle or adverse situation. And so that mental conditioning is vital to these processes. And each unit in each military has a different way of conducting them. There are a lot of similarities, but the milling is very much a British thing, but it has an intended outcome, and that outcome works, proven by the long history of British forces in combat.
So when you were in the Marines, not talking about Navy SEALs yet, but when you were in the Marines, did you go on operations? Were you on the front line? Did you experience kind of warfare?
No, and I sort of, that's a regret in my life, is I joined the U.S. Marines in 1998. There were no open conflicts. The global war didn't start till 2001. By the time the global war started in 2001, I was at a what we call a shore duty. I was in a non-deployable unit, and that's when I made the decision to switch to the SEAL teams. Trained a lot in the Marine Corps. We trained hard. But unfortunately, I did not get to experience war wearing the uniform of a U.S. Marine. That said, I served alongside Marines in combat, and they are a just seasoned fighting force with a very high standard. And that will always be a regret of my life that I didn't get that experience.
So 9/11 happens, 2001. Where were you? How did you react? And how did that change your military career?
So as I said, I was at a what we call a shore duty in a non-deployable unit. The Marine Corps had sent me back to college to become a Marine officer. I just finished Marine OCS in August of 2001. So less than 25 days later, the global war on terror happened. 9/11 happened. At first, I talked to my old man, my father, and said, "Hey, I'm going to request to go back to a deployable unit, 1st Recon Battalion, and get into the fight." He gave me sage advice and said, "This is going to be a long war." He knew I wanted to become a Navy SEAL, and he said, "Stay the course. You're going to get to combat." But to watch our nation get hit like that, which was a total surprise, and to lose over 3,000 lives, not all Americans, some British, several other nations lost people in the Twin Towers. It was a clarion call. We knew what we had to do, and we needed to strike back. Again, I think the thing now, with a little more wisdom and age, that bothers me is we knew that Al Qaeda was a problem. We knew that they were conducting attack planning against Western nations. And when you leave a cancer like that untouched and just let it metastasize and continue to grow, you're ultimately going to pay the price. So, while I'm in the military, I don't see, I'm not a hammer. I don't see anything or nothing but nails. We understand that we are in the profession of peace, but trained in the art of war. And that moral clarity I talk to is sometimes, even if they haven't attacked you, you have to attack trans-global terrorist organizations to keep them off balance. I think the biggest mistake by all of the nations is that some semblance of victory was declared in the global war on terror. This wasn't going to be a decade or 2-decade long fight. This is going to be a century-long fight. We're against an ideology. And that ideology, it's hard to stamp out an ideology. So that's why remaining in the Middle East, and unfortunately we should have remained in Afghanistan, would have allowed us to keep the pressure against these terrorist organizations and prevent them from conducting attack planning against the homeland, whether that's the UK or the United States. That's just the world we live in. I think the problem with a lot of people that either don't have travel experience to third world nations or never served in the military is they tend to look at the world through rose-colored glasses. The world is an evil and nasty place. And sometimes the road to peace means killing your enemies, not through diplomacy. Of course, we're all in favor of using diplomacy and international pressure first. But when that proves ineffective quickly, you've got to make morally concise, morally clear decisions, decisive actions to move against your enemies before they move against you, because ultimately you take more casualties, as we did on 9/11 that way. So I think I have a very different worldview shaped by my 20 years in the military and 10 combat deployments in and around the Middle East. I just have a very different view on the world.
Okay, so after 9/11, you make that decision to join the Navy SEALs. How long does that then take? And then can you take us through your first operations, your first tours in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. So BUD's basic underwater demolition school SEAL training, lasts a little over a year. The first part, the 6 months, that Hell Week is the rigorous part. They're still assessing and selecting you, and then after that 6 months, you go into about 3 to 6 months of training to now learn the tactical acumen required to do the job. So after that year, I reported into a West Coast SEAL team, ended up deploying multiple deployments to Iraq, AR, Ramadi, which Al-Qaeda had declared their caliphate, was where I deployed in 2005 and 2006. I ended up in the Battle of Ramadi in 2006, which was a hard-fought battle which ultimately we were victorious, and then ended up in the Battle of Sadr City in 2008. And after that, screened and selected for Tier 1 forces, and then did multiple combat deployments, which I just won't discuss publicly.
Let's start with Ramadi then, the battles there. What was your experience? What was the point of having the Navy SEALs involved in that? Did you have a very sort of specific task like this operation capturing Maduro, or was it a sort of broader help with the infantry and the rest of the armed forces?
You just nailed it. So in the Battle of Ramadi, we conducted sniper overwatch mission in support of the U.S. Army and Marine infantry on the ground. Those are the guys that truly won that battle. So we were technically in a support role. We were not the main element. The main element was the infantry. So we had established sniper positions on multiple operations through the course of 7 to 8 months to support and enable them to achieve their objective, which was the full scale clearance of Ramadi to remove it of any Al-Qaeda members. And it was, we took a lot of pride in supporting them on that mission. And it does show the integration of special operations and conventional infantry and how it can be an absolutely lethal force.
So there's this great film, American Sniper, which talks about exactly, I think, what you're talking about. Did you ever serve with him, or sort of did you look up to him as a great hero of yours?
I did not look up to him as a great hero. I did serve with him. I'll leave it at that.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's fascinating. Okay, so what about the other operations and missions that you're doing at this time? So there's Ramadi. Is there any specific examples of moments that you were involved in where, maybe you felt most under danger, under threat? What were the most kind of difficult times for you at that period?
Anytime I went outside the wire, I felt a semblance of fear. I felt endangered. But, the funny thing is, you'd asked about the military. One of the things I loved about the military is there's such a tribal nature to it. There's such a brotherhood and sisterhood with your fellow comrades that the largest fear I had, yes, the fear of bodily harm is evident and real. I mean, you're human. But it was the biggest fear was me letting down the guy to my left and to my right. And that was something I always thought about before I went on missions. God, please don't let me let the guys down. And you also, there's I don't want to say a sense of invincibility, but there is a sense of pride and confidence when you're surrounded by 20 absolute just warriors. You feel that no matter the challenges you face together collectively, you're going to figure them out. And I was young. We were young during the Battle of Ramadi, and call it that youthful inexperience. You sort of think you're untouchable. And unfortunately, we took casualties very early on, and that eroded at that sort of youthful confidence that, oh, hey, this is real. Despite 7 years of training under the best of the Marine Corps, the best of the Navy SEALs, my first time in combat was 7 years into the military. 6 or 7 years. And despite the amount of training I had done, you still feel ill prepared. And no matter how much we try to replicate combat within our training, realistic combat in our training, nothing quite matches the real thing. And sometimes it's just iterative. You got to get more combat operations under your belt, and you start to figure things out. You start to make adjustments to what maybe worked in training but doesn't work in combat. And so I look back on the Battle of Ramadi. We were young. We made a lot of mistakes. You don't know what you don't know. And it taught us a lot. Combat is a brutal mentor in life.
You talk about the kind of responsibility that you felt to your comrades to ensure their safety and be part of a team. But I know that there was also instances, and one particular famous one, I suppose, in which comrades of yours, or a particular comrade, even laid down his life to save yours and others. Can you talk about some of those anecdotes, those stories?
Yeah, I know what you're referring to. Not a subject I like to talk about, but in his memory, It was actually the last mission of the Battle of Ramadi, and actually data shows this. The most dangerous times of any combat deployment are like the first 3 weeks and the last 3 weeks, and the data proved to be absolutely right. On the very last mission, we were conducting a sniper overwatch mission in support of the first of the 506. That's the famed band of brothers from the HBO series. Same exact caliber of man from World War II to the global war on terror. We absolutely loved these infantry soldiers. We had a close relationship with us, and when they asked us to support them one last time, the immediate answer was yes. But ultimately, we made mistakes in the mission planning and preparation. Again, I don't excuse myself as an officer. We had the best intent, but as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The Army soldiers were going out. We weren't quite at full manning, and with good intent, we were going to support them anyways. And a series of firefights happened that day, and ultimately somebody got close enough to throw a grenade over the roof. And one of my guys, the youngest guy, without hesitation, jumped on the grenade because myself and another SEAL were within 3 feet of him. And he smothered the grenade with his body, and he was awarded posthumously our highest honor, known as the Medal of Honor. I think the equivalent would be your Victorian Cross, if I'm accurate. And it was crushing to watch that. It still replays in my mind, and that's just combat. You know, I'm one soldier, and every soldier who's been to combat has something that just sits on their shoulders for life. Sometimes we don't want to lift it off our shoulders because it's ours, and it's a memory of a fallen comrade. But he was an amazing young man. He was just selfless. He was quiet, had a dry sense of humor, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of him first thing in the morning and as I lay my head down at night.
So the Battle of Ramadi ends. What do you do next? Do you go back to America and then do another tour? Is that how it works?
It does. I was wounded from that incident, so I had to recover for about 6 months. But once I was cleared medically, I rejoined my SEAL team and started to prepare for another deployment to Iraq in 2008, in which we ended up in the Battle of Sadr City, fighting against Muqtada al-Sadr. He's a famous Shia cleric backed by Iranians, and he had conducted an offensive against Army soldiers. And we conducted the very same mission we had conducted in Ramadi, sniper overwatch, to support the infantry as they had objectives in Sadr City to retake that city.
And what were the kind of differences between those two battles? Was one harder than the other? And what were the similarities?
They were horrible in their unique ways. In Ramadi, we were fighting against Al-Qaeda. In Sadr City, we were fighting against the Sadr militia, but Iranian special groups, basically Iranian special forces, Quds forces, were amongst those soldiers in the Shia militia. So they also had the logistical backing of Iran, and they were using a new weapon known as an explosive forming projectile or penetrator, an EFP. So that was new to us on that battlefield. And unlike Al-Qaeda, who would fight to the death, the Sadr militia and the Iranian special forces groups were smart. They were ideological, but not to the point of their death. They would hit us hard, and then they would withdraw as quickly as possible, knowing that we would have fire superiority. So it was a much better military that we were up against, unconventional force, in ways made it a little bit of a bigger threat than Ramadi.
And were they the most difficult opponent that you came up against in your military career? Or were there others later on that were even harder to tackle?
Yeah, you know, each enemy, complicated by what terrain you're fighting on, makes each enemy unique. But even in Afghanistan, fighting against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, where they had the luxury of mountains and dug-in positions, that was a complex and hard fight as well. But there's so many factors that come into play with each theater and with each enemy. Ultimately, I'll say this: have respect for your enemy, especially the ones that have survived standing against the United States, the UK, and survived for many years. They're seasoned fighters themselves. They're smart, and they know how to circumvent our technological advances to fight against a superior military force. And you got to have a little respect for that. The second you stop respecting the enemy, ego comes into play. And again, that youthful confidence can get people, which was sometimes known as complacency, can get people killed.
Can you talk about the transition from what you call it, well, I suppose it's the name of it, but what a tier 2 Navy SEAL to a tier 1? How does that work? Why did you do that? Can you just explain that process?
Yeah, tier 1 forces are the most, again, similar to your SBS and SAS, are just the most lethal warriors in the world. And what I found about these individuals is they're kind, they're empathetic, they're respectful, they know restraint. They can turn on a switch to do a very dirty job. But, not everyone is cut out. In fact, a very small minority is cut out to serve at that level. The only thing I'll say, to put it into perspective, the SEAL community is elite. But only 1 out of 40 SEALs has what it takes to make it to the tier 1 level. They go through a whole nother assessment and selection, which is very mentally and psychologically taxing, and a horrible assessment and selection training to go through in order to make it to that level.
And what inspired you to go through that selection? Was someone encouraging you to do so, or was this on your own kind of initiative?
It was on my own initiative. Again, that very human question I brought up earlier as a young man. Do I have what it takes to serve at this level? There is a element of drive in the pursuit of excellence to give it a shot. And what's the worst that could happen? I fail. I'll go back to a SEAL team and continue serving. So it was that question. And I had met a few of them, and I was absolutely impressed by the individuals they were. They were statistically older, more highly educated. They were just some of the best operators you'll ever meet in the world. And I wanted to see if I had what it took, and that's what drove me.
When it came to mission successes and mission failures, what was the kind of percentage like? How many of them succeeded? How many of them failed? And what really differentiated the two? What were the biggest factors in why you succeeded and why you failed?
Yeah. We had a lot more successes than we have failures. But the failures stick with you, even if they're few and far between. And that's damaging. But if, you'd have to look at a particular mission, and we dissect every mission through something called an after action review or a hot wash. And you really get to the root cause analysis of what went wrong. And sometimes we learn more from failure than we do from successes. And, those are memorialized. When you fail, those lessons are memorialized and then integrated into your doctrine and your process and procedure to make sure that they never happen again.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.